here. I've got quite a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to go straight into it. I've called this talk Contexts for Central Bank Digital Currency. When I was asked to talk to a Bitcoin group about central bank digital currency, I was surprised, as I know almost nothing about Bitcoin, and one of the reasons I'm here actually is to ask you to educate me in it as well, and only a little about CBDC, or at least until I was asked to do this talk, and I started doing a lot more research on it. I'm neither an economist nor a banker, and I have just enough money to pay my bills without investing it into cryptocurrency. However, over the last 3 years, I have been writing and publishing about what I call the global biosecurity state. Now, by this term, I mean that nexus of organizations, treaties, agendas, regulations, programs, technologies, and ideologies that have emerged from the revolution in Western capitalism being implemented on the justification of responding to multiple manufactured crises. It's in the context of these crises, health, environmental, the cost of living, energy, geopolitical, and numerous others, and the solutions proposed to address them, that I was asked by one of your members, Alistair, to situate central bank digital currency. I think the phrase he wanted is, he wanted me to come in here and kind of join the dots between all these things. So, this is my first premise. No new technology is good or bad in itself, just as no new technology comes into use outside of programs for its use. And only its application can and will determine whether we should embrace or resist its implementation. I can't quite remember now how mobile phones were sold to us all those years ago. Beyond the promises of convenience and progress and a competitive edge, but I don't recall them being told that they would become the tracking devices for a system of surveillance and control that it is becoming increasingly hard not to describe as totalitarian. Neither does the application of new technology exist in isolation from other technologies and other programs, some of which are conditioned of its own operability, others sharing the same goal. What I want to do in this talk, therefore, is to discuss the contexts, economic, social, political, environmental, in which central bank digital currency is, in the parlance of our day, being rolled out. The avid promoters of CBDC, which include our unelected Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, say very little about its necessity, its applications, and its benefits beyond similar claims to progress fighting financial crime, which I think would be a first for the Bank of England and our government, and of course sustainability, which is now the justification for every new removal of our human rights or civil liberty. But the wider and expanding context of the global biosecurity state, I believe, give us a more accurate understanding of the real application of central bank digital currency and indeed of its intended purpose. So I divided my talk into 3 parts. And the first part is called, it's kind of a question everyone's asking, there's a lot of misinformation about it, is it programmable? I'm going to talk about that. Now, CBDC is digital or electronic money for households and businesses alike, so we're told. The Bank of England, which calls it the digital pound, it's the terminology they're using, says CBDC is not a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. You're meant to boo at this point. Because it is not privately issued, but instead a liability of the bank, and that's a term I'll come back to later, and will therefore retain its value over time, rather than being subject to rapid fluctuations in value as happens with investments in crypto assets. Significantly, the Bank of England describes CBDC as the safest form of money available. And that's a value, safety is a value with the greatest currency in the global biosecurity state. It itself is a currency. If, or more accurately when, it is implemented, the Bank of England will make central bank money available to the public in digital form for the first time. As of last November, the Bank of England insists that CBDC will not replace, but instead, this is the phrase they use, exist alongside cash and bank deposits. Now, go back to how we got here. The Bank of England published its first paper on CBDC in March 2020, which coincidentally is the same month that lockdown restrictions were imposed on the UK, largely closing down the real economy for the next 2 years. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, who at that time was Rishi Sunak, another coincidence, set up a CBDC task force in April 2021, shortly after the second spike in UK deaths attributed to COVID-19. Now, this joint task force between the Treasury and the Bank of England is working with the central banks of other countries and states, as well as with the Bank for International Settlements, which I'll also come back to. The same month, the Bank of England set up 2 forums, one for CBDC technology, the other for CBDC implementation and operation. These include its use, its functions, the role of the public and private sectors, its implications for data privacy, and what the Bank of England, with a nod to the newly enforced orthodoxies of woke, calls financial and digital inclusion. It's another one of these kind of buzz terms, isn't it? By this, they mean not how everyone will have access to this wonderful new advancement in digital technology, but rather how everyone is going to be forced to adopt it. In June 2021, Tom Mutton, who's the director of the Bank of England's Central Bank Digital Currency Unit, addressed why we need another form of digital money to that already offered by the private sector. One of the needs apparently is to avoid the risks presented by new forms of private money creation, like Bitcoin. Another is improving the availability and usability of central bank money to all British citizens. Another is building a platform for better cross-border payments. Another is what he claimed is the greater efficiency of the digital pound when compared to the energy costs of Bitcoin. They really don't like you, kind of stuff. Which the Agenda 2020 compliant G7 nations have said should be a core consideration of CBD design, this reduction in energy costs. I'm not sure I really buy that. The rest were vague promises about meeting future payment needs in a digital economy and the apparently completely natural and not at all managed decline in the use of cash. Of more interest than his touting of these apparent benefits was Tom Mutton's admission that CBDC could support, this is a quote, could support wider public policy objectives. Very important, because that's a new role for money. Germane to this new role as policy supporter is CBDC technology, which allows it to be programmable. By this, Mutton means that transactions using CBDC can occur or not occur automatically, and again quote, according to certain conditions, rules, or events. So how is this going to work? The proposed architecture of CBDC is that at the top, you've got the central bank core ledger. This is accessed on the second level by an application programming interface, an API, that regulates and authorizes the third level, the private payment interface providers, the PIP. And it's through those that us, the users at the bottom, the registered users at the bottom, can access central bank digital currency. This is the architecture they're looking at the moment. Now, importantly, the API is different from a user interface in that it connects computer programs, not a computer to a person. It also hides the internal details of how that system works. The Bank of England claims that it will not be able to program our money or how we spend it. That's what they say. However, it adds that if and when CBDC is introduced, the programmability features will be designed by the private sector companies providing the payment interface, so the third level. Last July, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, John Cunliffe, who is overseeing the Bank of England's work on central bank digital currencies, confirmed that this interface with the public will be provided by commercial banks. Now in the UK, where 5 banks account for 90% of all deposits, that means HSBC Holdings, the Lloyds Banking Group, the NatWest Group, the Royal Bank of Scotland Group, and Barclays. But as the Bank of International Settlements indicated in its report published back in September 2021 about the system design and interoperability of CBDC, payment interface providers might also include big tech companies, which means Alphabet, that is Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft. Now, passing the buck on what this will mean in practice, in June 2021, the Bank of England called on government ministers to decide whether CBDC should be programmable, and therefore giving the issuer control over how it is spent by the recipient. Mutton commented, and I quote, "There could be some socially beneficial outcomes from that, preventing activity which is seen to be socially harmful in some way. But at the same time, it could be a restriction on people's freedoms." Now, beyond a means to support public policy objectives, therefore, it appears CBDC will also be a means to prevent, so support and prevent actions of the public deemed to be harmful. As the last 3 years have demonstrated, and the online safety bill will write into legislation, that includes so-called harmful actions. The government, questioning the government on anything from the dangers of experimental gene therapies to the tenets of environmental fundamentalism. This is the context in which we should understand what a restriction on our freedoms means, a term used by Cunliffe. No wonder that an anonymous spokesman for the Treasury confirmed programmability is a potential feature of a central bank digital currency. From what its designers and promoters have said, I'd say it is the primary feature of CBDC. Excuse me. Tom Mutton also highlighted that the problem of how users identify themselves, and in doing so ensure the inclusivity of CBDC for every lucky citizen, would be solved by a system of digital identity, which the government has just closed the consultation on. He framed this in terms of a trade-off between the privacy of the users and the security of CBDC against financial crime. He admitted this will, regretfully, but inevitably, entail sharing information about the identity of the users with the payment interface providers, the commercial, who would therefore be responsible for security and also for the privacy and uses of the user's personal data. We've already had numerous examples of where this leads, most famously demonstrated by the agreement between Facebook and the UK private intelligence company Cambridge Analytica, which is to the market sale of our private data by information technology companies to the highest bidder. It sounds very much, therefore, as if central bank digital currency cannot be implemented without digital identity. That's what everyone says, that understands this better than I, and that digital identity is being justified by, among other programs, the joys and benefits of CBDC. It is not by chance that the same week the government published its consultation on the digital pound, it also published its consultation on digital identity. Neither of these consultations asks us, the British public, whether we want either. Today, of the 119 currencies considering implementing CBDC, it is being researched in 39 of them. In 33, including the UK, the USA, the European Union, Japan, Brazil and Canada, is being developed. 17, including China, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Russia and the Ukraine, have a pilot scheme. And 11, including the Bahamas, Jamaica and Nigeria, which we'll come back to, have already launched it. In February 2023, the Bank of England and the Treasury together announced that a central bank digital currency will be launched in the UK this decade and be operational by 2025 at the earliest. Suggestively, it proposed limiting individual holdings of digital wallets to between £10,000 and £20,000, with the former limit holding the existing balance, salary and bonuses of 75% of the UK population, that's 10 grand, and the latter limit, 20 grand, 95% of the UK population. This, to me, doesn't sound like a currency that would exist alongside cash. Sounds like one's going to replace it. Finally, in the consultation paper, jointly published by the Bank of England and the Treasury this month, and which stretches to over 100 pages, only one page mentions the question of programmability. My experience is exactly how consultations work. It states, quote, "We do not propose to develop a digital pound that enables government or central bank initiated programmable money. While it may be possible to program the digital pound so that it could only work in certain ways, this is not relevant to His Majesty's Treasury and the bank's policy objectives for the digital pound. However, His Majesty's Treasury and the bank would permit payment interface providers and external service interface providers to implement such functionalities themselves. But they would require user consent and not be at His Majesty Treasury or the bank's direction. So it's up to the interface to do this. More about this is said in the Bank of England's accompanying technology working paper, in which it proposes the use of what it calls smart contracts that provide API access to locking mechanisms with configurable conditions in the core ledger. This locking mechanism would require, and they say, earmarking funds with set conditions on when the funds can be released, and programming the earmarked funds to only release the payment when a linked event has completed conditions under the contract or programmed rules. This is how the locking mechanism is being talked about now. The way the Bank of England has presented the programmability function of CBDC to the British public is as a means to check and transfer funds to our digital pound balance, purchase goods with a smartphone, pay for services, order commodities online, and allocate funds to pay our rent, standing orders and other regular payments. That's the way they're discussing it. Ease and convenience. So nothing to worry about then. The Bank of England and the Treasury won't program its digital currency with rules, but the commercial banks and information technology companies providing the payment interface through which we use it can do so, including contracted conditions of use which, if not met, activate a locking mechanism between us and the core ledger of central bank digital currency. But only apparently if we want it. So what could possibly go wrong? That's what I'm going to talk about into part two. Part two of my talk is called Other Programs of the Great Reset. With such assurances from the Bank of England and His Majesty's Treasury, what are the worries and fears about central bank digital currency, and should we listen to them? These can be summed up with the argument that CBDC is not being put forward in isolation, but as part of a revolutionary change, not only in the technologies of what is being called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but also in the programs implementing them. It is only by looking at these programs, therefore, that we can grasp the economic, political, social, and, as we've seen, the environmental contexts in which CBDC is being developed, will be implemented, and eventually become operative within the next 5 years or so, perhaps less. It's unlikely, to put it mildly, that the huge work of building the technology for the digital pound, on which the Bank of England has embarked, will be rejected by the Treasury when it's completed. How then are they going to implement it against the expected resistance? The simple answer to that is they're going to do it in conjunction with the technologies and programs of the global biosecurity state and the regulations and restrictions that enforce those programs. Implemented as mere upgrades to the infrastructure of the nation state, these are fundamentally, and perhaps irreversibly, changing the social contract between the citizen and the state, and with it the ability of the ruled, that is us, to scrutinise, influence or hold our rulers to account. Largely unknown to the general public, preoccupied with pronouns, the royal family, hugging Volodymyr Zelensky, Matt Hancock's text messages, and now Gary Lineker's tweets. These programs include, but are not limited to, the following, and I want to go through these because you may not have heard of them or be aware of their scope. Number one, as I mentioned, digital identity. Digital identity holding our biometric data and monitoring our compliance with the constantly updated requirements to be injected as many times and with whatever the state tells us, made a condition of access to the rights of citizenship. We got very, very close to that with vaccine passports, and they have not gone away. This will include our freedom of movement, and under future manufactured crises, our freedom of association and assembly, and perhaps, if the fundamentalists have our way, our right to education, work, or medical treatment, or liberty itself. In October 2019, the World Bank proposed acting as a central repository of data relating to the good practices of countries implementing digital identity. They suggested they facilitate the transfer of information to interested parties and incentivize compliance with preferential loans and grants. Digital ID is the gateway to the enforcement of all the other programs. Indeed, in May 2021, the Financial Times reported what CBDC research and experimentation appears to be showing is that it will be nigh on impossible to issue such currencies outside of a comprehensive national digital ID management system. This meaning CBDCs will likely be tied to personal accounts that include personal data, credit history, and other forms of relevant information. And I think that's where the blockchain technology is kind of germane to that. Another program, Universal Basic Income. For the millions of workers, primarily from white-collar jobs, made redundant by the new technologies, markets, and programs of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and this great reset of Western capitalism it has enabled. It's not impossible that reception of UBI, as some people think, will eventually be made conditional on accepting an RFID, a radio frequency identification chip implanted under the skin that would not only allow us to receive and make payments, but also for the state to track our movements and monitor and limit those payments. One might soberly reflect that no one is going to give us free money, which is what UBI is kind of being talked about, unless they have absolute control over how we spend it. And third one, a system of social credit, modelled on that currently employed in the People's Republic of China, in which both citizens and businesses are given a credit rating based on their compliance not only with the laws, but also with the behavioural norms of the state. Among other means suggested by the International Monetary Fund in August 2020, this rating will be established through access to our personal online browsing, search and purchase history, and the compliance of our businesses with criteria of production, consumption, sustainability, employment rights, trade partners, etc. Facial recognition technology, which the police in the UK have already been using for some time to stop and search members of the public without cause in order to build up a database of the population, and which will be used in conjunction with digital ID to identify citizens not compliant with the norms and regulations of the biosecurity state. That's the way it's being used in China. As we have had demonstrated over the past 3 years, these are not being made by our elected national governments, but rather by unelected and unaccountable international technocracies, like the WHO, like the WEF, like the European Commission, who are overseeing global finance, expenditure, consumption, energy, health, agriculture, animal husbandry, education, and as we're seeing in the Ukraine, war. These decisions are not being made by our elected representatives and governments anymore. Smart cities, in which our freedom of movement, assembly, association, access, business, consumption, ownership, privacy, expression and thought will be monitored, analysed and controlled by the Internet of Things, by which we are increasingly surrounded. Since at least 2018, the Trilateral Commission has promoted the use of artificial intelligence technology to analyse, monitor and shape our behaviour. This is currently being implemented in the UK by local authorities enforcing the restrictions of so-called 15-minute cities, an invention of the World Economic Forum, which violate our freedom of movement under Protocol number 4, Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. I wonder why they're doing that, something which has been designed by the World Economic Forum. These restrictions on what initially the number of times we are allowed to leave our designated limits in a car will be monitored by a panopticon of surveillance equipment, and with punishments that start at fines and extend undoubtedly to electric cars being switched off, I'll talk about later. And other punitive measures which are already being used in China's system of social credit, which includes being refused the use of even public transport. Right now they're doing a pilot program on having AI in the tubes in London. Just in case you think this was about saving the planet, they want to monitor how we use public transport as well. Now, the environmental fundamentalists who justify such restrictions because it's in a car are the same as the COVID fundamentalists who justified lockdown, masks and mandatory gene therapy, and they are equally blind to where it will lead. Once you accept that human rights are contingent on what the state declares is the common good, you're on the road to fascism, which is what the title of my book is. And if we think this only applies to cars and is being implemented to save the planet, as I said, London Underground is implementing smart stations, as they call them, using AI technology to monitor, record, analyse and learn from our every movement and action. These are their terms. It is a short and rapid step from someone stopping us leaving a jurisdiction in a car, a bus or a train to stopping us leaving or entering without other technologies like digital identity and even more intrusive biotechnology. As an example of which, the Internet of Bodies. Internet of Things connects us all together, but we're connected to it by the Internet of Bodies, by which we're connected to this system of surveillance and control. Now, this includes, this is just a cross-section so far, pharmaceutical products carrying a microchip registering when they are and are not ingested to ensure compliance. A quantum dot dye delivered with gene therapy that stores information about the injected person's medical history and biosecurity status, whether they're up to speed with their shots. A microprocessor in storing encrypted payment data implanted under the skin of our hand to allow contactless payments. A smartphone app that tracks our individual carbon footprint in order to monitor and control what and how much we consume, and even a microchip planted into our brain to augment reality. Now, you've probably heard these being dismissed as right-wing conspiracy theories in the mouths of snorting MPs in Parliament and the propagandists for compliance in our media. But the microchipped tablet was announced by Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, at the World Economic Forum in January 2018. The quantum dot dye vaccine by researchers funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at MIT in December 2019. The skin implants by Walletmore, a Polish-British startup company, in October 2021. The carbon footprint tracker by the president of the Alibaba Group, again at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in May 2022, and the brain implant by the Vice President of Research and Design for a nanoelectronics and digital technology company on the website of the World Economic Forum in August 2022. These are all up and running, and there's undoubtedly many more. When it comes to the technologies of our enslavement, our conspiracy theories fall well short of the digital, virtual and augmented reality being prepared for us. The Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response Treaty, about which I've just published an article, launched by the World Health Organization in December 2021 and adopted by the European Council in March 2022. Under this treaty, the 194 member states of the World Health Organization will be legally bound to implement restrictions on human rights and freedoms such as mandatory face masks, lockdowns, compulsory gene therapy, digital identity, and far, far worse. on the judgment of an international health technocracy that is funded by and subject to lobbying by the most powerful nations and international companies in the world, and particularly its largest private funder, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Under this agreement, nation states, which includes the UK, will in principle concede their sovereignty to decide which restrictions will be imposed on their populations. Crucially, once written into a legally binding treaty, and please have a look at this treaty because it's one of the most extraordinary documents I've read in 3 years of extraordinary documents. Once it's written into this treaty, the efficacy or logic of these biosecurity so-called measures will no longer be open even to what little debate we've had in this country. Instead, the World Health Organization will effectively become a global form of the UK's SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. That is a politically appointed technocracy to which the governments of nation states must defer if they wish to retain their status in the global biosecurity state. The WHO talks about mechanisms for compliance, which means sanctions and God knows what else. What this does, it serves to depict what are undemocratic and unaccountable forms of governance as technical responses to new crises. My argument that this is a completely new model of governance, which is explicitly and in practice anti-democratic, unaccountable. It's a technocratic form of governance by global technocracies. Sustainable Development Goals. Again, these were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 under the rubric of Agenda 2030. Now, behind their humanitarian objectives, these allocate the flow of global capital, investment, and other preferential treatments to governments and corporations according to their compliance with environmental, social, and governance criteria, ESG criteria. Despite their UN branding, these are formulated and imposed by the wealthiest and most powerful international corporate asset managers in the world, like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street Global Advisor, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, etc. Now, far from saving the planet from exploitation by multinational corporations, Sustainable Development Goals are designed to increase the monopoly of wealthy Western economies and international companies able to meet those criteria over poorer countries, and also to create the framework for purchasing their UN-assigned quota of emissions in carbon credits. On the same justification, developing countries are loaded with debt by financial organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in order to meet these goals. And those unable to meet repayments, either through increased taxation or spending cuts to their already impoverished populations, will be invited to hand over their land and natural resources to their debtors, which is exactly what's going on in Ukraine right now. And finally, central bank digital currency, which employs blockchain technology to log every transaction we ever make and is programmable, as we've seen, with restrictions and limits on expenditure, contingent on, for example, our biosecurity status or our carbon footprint, or as we've seen in China, our social compliance. Could it, for example, be used to switch off access to digital money for those who violate the limits of 15-minute cities, or of those who fail to meet the biosecurity state's definition of fully vaccinated, or who fail to upgrade their car to an electric vehicle, or who neglect to recycle their rubbish, or who eat more than their allotted quota of meat and dairy products, or who leave their heating on beyond the allotted times, of those the state describes as a threat to the common good, for daring to criticise the government or indeed the central banks themselves. When our salaries and our savings are in CBDC, it would no longer be necessary to evoke emergency powers, as the government of Justin Trudeau did in Canada in February 2022, to freeze the bank accounts of the non-compliant without a court order. They can do it like that. In effect, CBDC will become a form of geofencing. But if instead of receiving an electric shock in our ear for transgressing beyond the limits of our 15-minute grazing range, we will have our access to the necessities of life removed, including work, healthcare, energy or food from animals or crops that haven't been genetically modified, for example. The question I'm trying to formulate is whether, given the context in which it will be implemented and the demonstrated willingness of the governments of the West to lock down, spy on, control the movements of and punish their citizens for the common good that we've seen over the past 3 years, whether CBDC is likely to be so programmed. Yeah, go on now. It clearly can be programmed. I would suggest that these contexts make it more than likely that it will be, and indeed that this programming is the primary but undeclared purpose of central bank digital currency. Okay, part 3, I'm getting there. Back to the CBDC after that. And it's called Towards Absolute Control, which is a quote. You may recognize it. As I mentioned above, the Bank of England has said that it is working with the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank for its membership of 63 central banks. These account for about 95% of world GDP. And they include the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, and the US Federal Reserve System. Its general manager, Agustin Carstens, who is the primary advocate for the adoption of CBDC by the members of the BIS, in December 2020 made this by now famous statement about what he calls the general use of central bank digital currency. You've probably all heard this, haven't you? But let's repeat it. Usually these people say nothing, do they? But this time he really revealed a lot, I think. He said, I feel like doing it in that strange accent of his, but I won't try it. We tend to establish equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. With cash, we don't know who is using a $100 bill today. A key difference with CBDC is that central banks will have absolute control over the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank digital currency. These for me are the key words in this. They will have absolute control over the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, he says, we will have the technology to enforce that. These two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is. I believe him. Okay, what appears certain is that CBDC will allow central banks to act like commercial banks in providing loans to both private and public sector lenders. This is what happened following the second global financial crisis in 12 years that started with a spike in interest rates in the repurchase agreement market in September 2019, months before anyone had heard of COVID. 3 months before anyone had heard of COVID-19, and 6 months before lockdown was imposed across Western economies. On the suggestion of our old friend BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, I think currently it's got $10 trillion in assets under management, the US Federal Reserve injected hundreds of billions of dollars into the financial system, effectively providing zero interest loans to JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, the Bank of America, and other favoured commercial banks. By July 2020, when we were all under lockdown worrying about this terrible new disease, the cumulative value of these loans was $11.23 trillion. As a result of this vast quantitative easing program, which was then adopted around the world on the justification of sustaining national economies then under lockdown, by April 2022, the total assets of the US Federal Reserve, which had reached $8.9 trillion, the European Central Bank, $9.6 trillion, the Bank of Japan, $6.2 trillion, and the People's Bank of China, $6.3 trillion, had risen to $31 trillion. That's an extraordinary and genuinely unprecedented increase from the 19 trillion it had in September 2019. This made the quantitative easing program after the first global financial crisis in 2027-8 pale into insignificance. Not insignificance, but pale in terms of size. Now, these total assets have fallen to, last time I looked this month, 28.5 trillion. Across the globe, over 41.4 trillion in assets, nearly half the world's GDP, are now held by central banks. With this increase in assets comes a corresponding increase in the liabilities over whose rules and regulations Agustín Carsten wants absolute control. Liability, or what a bank owes to others, includes the total amount of currency in circulation, the reserves in commercial banks, mortgage-backed securities and equity capital, and with it the risks to the real and financial sectors of the economy. We should remember that when we think we are depositing our money into a bank, we are under law doing nothing of the sort. As explained by Richard Werner, I'm sure you all know, do you know? The German economist who invented the monetary policy of quantitative easing for the Bank of Japan back in 1995. What we do when we think we deposit our money in a bank is make a loan to the bank, which borrows from the public. And equally, when we think we take out a loan from a bank, in reality the bank purchases a security, which is to say a promissory note, which is issued by us to the bank. But no money is transferred to our account. What we call a deposit is merely a record the bank makes of its debt to the public. And what we think we are receiving as money from a loan is merely the bank's record of what it owes us. Banks, despite their protestations to the contrary, are not intermediaries between deposits and lenders. They are magicians that magic money into existence with a sleight of hand. Having purchased our promissory note, they record what is an accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract as a customer deposit. But no money has been deposited. When banks lend, they create money out of nothing by inventing fictitious claims on themselves. Now, as long as bank credit, which is to say the creation of money, is for investment and loans for new goods, services and technologies that add value to the economy, it creates stable economic growth without inflation. It also generates the sustainable income streams to repay the loans. That's how an economy expands. However, when the money is created to increase consumption, inflation rises, which is what's happening across the world as the vast sums of magic money printed to shore up the collapsing financial sector have entered into the real economy. Worse still, when money is created for financial transactions, which make up over 70% of all lending in the UK, banks, rather than adding value to the economy, create new purchasing power over existing assets, whose prices are therefore pushed up. Land prices, oil prices, housing prices, as we've seen over the past 2 decades, and as we're experiencing now, energy prices. This creates, on the one hand, greater and greater inequality, and on the other, credit bubbles, as commercial banks increase the number and size of loans. And then the bubble bursts. One of the purposes of CBDC is to ensure that small independent banks with the power to make money don't start lending money to small and medium-sized businesses to create new goods and services, thereby reducing inequality and increasing our independence from both the state for investment and the financial sector for credit. When central bank digital currency has been implemented and doesn't exist alongside cash, as the Bank of England assures us, but has instead replaced it, as seems far more likely, what we think of now as our money will instead be, as Agustín Carsten's very precisely phrased it, it will be an expression of central bank liability. What this means, what it could mean, what it appears likely to mean, and what I would say the wider context in which CBDC is being implemented overwhelmingly indicates that it does mean, is that if the central bank doesn't approve of how we are expressing its liability, it will have what Carsten's boasted are the rules, the regulations and the technology to limit and control where, when and on what we can spend their money. And that goes up to and including the point of us having none to spend. As the Bank of England and the Treasury have specified, the private payment interface provider, which is to say the most powerful commercial banks and information technology companies in the world, will have the technology to program conditions into CBDC that will activate a locking mechanism when they are not met, when these conditions are not met or if they are violated. And since these private providers are operating under the environmental, social and corporate governance criteria being imposed by BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan and other corporate asset managers in furtherance of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the signed commitment of the governments of the West to Agenda 2030, they will be obliged, doubtless with a show of protest, to program CBDC with the limits and requirements on expenditure and in consumption that meet these goals in this agenda. And I hope by now you know what those are. Huge, massive reduction in energy, food consumption, etc. They've created the conditions which are going to force them to impose what they want on us. The key point is, this will no longer be our money, but instead an expression of central bank liability. The Bank of England is liable for how, when, and on what we spend its digital currency. And it is the central banks and other stakeholders that compose the new global technocracy that will determine the rules and regulations by which we spend it. Programmable CBDC is that technology that Carstens talks about. Now, since its founding in 1694, the Bank of England has made it clear that money in the UK is a promissory note, with the terms written on the paper notes we call cash. It says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of X pounds, signed by the chief cashier for the governor and company of the Bank of England. When cash has been withdrawn as a form of currency, and there is no longer anything for us to bear, the bearer, in our wallets, one day perhaps even in our private bank accounts, that promise to pay will lie within the purview and liability of the central bank. And what we now call money will be reduced to the expression of its largesse. That, I believe, is what Augustine Carsten means by absolute control. And I think for once he's using terms accurately. Even for the overwhelming mass of the UK population that does exactly as it is told, including injecting experimental gene therapies into its own arms and those of its children, those who remain within the boundaries of its 15-minute cities, those who consume its allotted share of insects, and those who take, without question or complaint, what it is given, CBDC will keep it poor and compliant. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. The World Economic Forum has been telling us that for many years now. And I think this is how they're going to do it. Or we will ultimately be deprived of the necessities of living. Central bank digital currency is part of the infrastructure for a tokenized economy. Currency not as a means of exchange, but as reward for compliance. This is what Tom Mutton intimated when he said that the digital pound, and again, I quote, can support wider public policy objectives and prevent, again, quote, activity which is seen to be socially harmful. Those are his words. Under these terms, CBDC will be an automated form of governance enforced outside of any legislative or juridical mediation. Comply or starve, effectively, at the most extreme. People will comply. This is a system of totalitarian control, the like of which the world has never seen before, and it's being implemented right now. And once implemented, short of a revolutionary overthrow of the global biosecurity state, it will be very, very difficult to reverse. Indeed, in the written evidence submitted to the UK Parliament in September 2022, the Digital Pound Foundation, whose board of members have numerous links to the WF, wrote, "The introduction of new forms of digital money," this is them, "whether public or private in form, is irreversible." And I, for one, believe them, as does Richard Werner, who I introduced before, who understands CBDC far better than I ever will. He is unequivocal about its purpose. At a conference held by the Monetary Institute in Switzerland back in February 2018, so years ago now, he described the bid for central bank digital currency to achieve total control over all economic transactions as, I quote, "the greatest concentration of central banking power in history," the aim of which, he said, is an Orwellian dystopia of total control over people and the end of any freedoms. This is not an anarchist, this is not a far left whatever, this is a senior economist who has advised banks all over the world. When he uses these terms, I think we better listen. Was he right? Well, in Nigeria, the only large country to have implemented CBDC, the results have been disastrous. Nick Corbishley has been following its implementation closely. He has reported out of a population of nearly 220 million people, only 905,000, that is 0.4%, have downloaded a digital wallet, and a mere 282,600 accounts have actually become active. In response to this reluctance, what do they call it nowadays, non-compliance, the government has issued repeatedly deferred deadlines for the withdrawal of cash from circulation. As a result, as a result of this threat, 80% of the 7.2 billion previously held in private hands has been deposited with financial institutions. And there is now a limit of $225 per week has been imposed on cash withdrawals for individuals and 5 times that for businesses. And this has left the population with an acute shortage of money. You've probably seen in the papers, they're actually reporting it for once, people attacking banks and so on and so forth. Thousands of people are dying, etc., etc. Businesses are completely unable to trade. Further reductions have been threatened. Now, unlike the Bank of England, the Central Bank of Nigeria has been very open in its declarations that the motivation for these monetary restrictions is the drive to what they call a cashless economy. How much time have I got left? A little bit longer? Can I go a little bit longer? Yeah? Part 4. Sorry, I forgot there's 4 parts actually. It's the surprise part. The masters of the world. Again, not my quote. I'll end with a question, but it's got a big preamble. The 10 largest national economies in the world by gross domestic product are the USA, China, Japan, Germany, the UK, India, France, Russia, Italy and Brazil. Between them, these countries produce a gross domestic product of $68.5 trillion, more than 2/3 of global GDP. Their collective debt, however, is over $79 trillion. That's a public debt to GDP ratio of 117%. The odd one out in this list is Russia. It's only got $421 billion of debt. That's about an eighth of what they've got in Germany, India, France, Italy, and in the UK. In comparison, the USA has a national debt of $31.6 trillion. That gives it a public debt to GDP ratio of 94.75%. Now, this has risen from, so it's 94.75% now, and probably going up as we speak. This has risen from 63% in 2007, the year when the last global financial crisis began, which of course that began on the subprime mortgage crisis, didn't it? With all that fake money being driving up assets. It's risen from 55% in 2001, which was the year the US created the security state under the cloak of the so-called War on Terror, and from 31% in 1981, the year Ronald Reagan was elected president and began to impose the monetary and fiscal policies of neoliberal capitalism not only in the USA, but across the rest of the world. The US external debt to GDP ratio, that is, the debt owed by the US government not to the American public, but to other countries, which increases the risk of defaulting and, of course, decreases economic growth, is 93.28%. In comparison, the external debt to GDP ratio of Russia is just 26.43%, and of China, just 17.71%. In the UK, does anyone have a guess? It's 298.49%, which is among the highest in the world. Certainly easily of the biggest countries. This is one measure, it's only one measure, of the financial crisis Western capitalism is facing. So, how have the leaders of the West responded? Well, last month, the ideologues and the architects of the global biosecurity state gathered at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where, on the justification of responding to numerous manufactured crises, whose cause and effects they took pleasure in describing, except for one. There's one crisis they never mention, the financial crisis. They elected themselves effectively to form an openly technocratic, authoritarian world government. When I was listening to them, I was very struck that they don't even play lip service anymore to anything that you might describe as democratic or accountable. If you allow me, I'd like to quote some of the things they say, because I think this again, you'll see what my question is. I think you'll guess, what do you think these guys are going to do? They don't talk about CBDC, but they talk about all these other things. So let's start with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the unelected European Commission, and she herself is an agenda contributor to the World Economic Forum. Now, if you remember, in October 22 last year, she threatened the electorate of Italy that if they didn't vote for the Commission's preferred candidate, the European Commission, had the tools to cut off EU funding to Italy. Do you remember that? Extraordinary statement. Now, she said that we are facing the greatest industrial transformation of our times and maybe of any times. She predicted that those who develop and manufacture the technology that will be the foundation of tomorrow's economy will have the greatest competitive edge. I would say they have the greatest monopoly. Someone else, Albert Bourla, the Chief Executive Officer of Pfizer, which is the largest pharmaceutical company in the world by revenue last year, for reasons we all know, himself is a long-standing agenda contributor to the World Economic Forum. He announced that messenger RNA gene therapies sold and mandated as vaccines for both COVID-19 and now seasonal influenza combined will be made, so you can get it, just get everything, just inject everything. They will be available to governments of the world later this year, at a price, of course. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the UK and another agenda contributor to the World Economic Forum, said that they should be helping countries to develop a national digital infrastructure for their healthcare systems, which they will need because of the gene therapies, which they call vaccines. Now, so the gene therapies are being used to justify vaccine as a digital ID, the same way CBDC is as well. He added that this digital infrastructure would have, quote, an impact beyond any particular disease or pandemic. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, another agenda contributor, said that, well, it's Bill Gates' former company, which we have to remember since 2007 has been handing the private data of us, UK citizens, over to the US National Security Agency. He said it's producing software that, through what he calls carbon accounting, allows banks to measure the carbon footprint of small businesses before granting them loans. Yeah, these are the sort of conditions which are going to be imposed on central bank digital currency. Jim Hagemann Schnaber, the chairman of Siemens, the largest industrial manufacturing company in Europe, he's a member of the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. He called not for reduction in production, but for 1 billion people to stop eating meat. This is an interesting one. Patricia Popper, if that's how you say her name, she's the CEO of the Pacific Gas and Electricity Corporation. This is the company which caused the wildfires back in 2018 that caused over $40 billion of damage, destroyed 33,000 buildings and killed 124 people, but she didn't want to talk about that. What she said that in order for us to transition to an electric grid, an automated system will make it possible to turn off supply to smart devices, including Wi-Fi and electric vehicles. She added that those who have invested in an electric car should get its full value by giving its power back to the grid. Getting there. And Bastien Giraud, a Green Party member of the Swiss National Council and also a corporate sustainability advisor to a Swiss carbon finance consultancy. He said that government should only buy from companies compliant with the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030, and that we should build environments in which people not only cannot but do not want to use cars. He described this as living in harmony with nature. Christopher Wray, the director of the US Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, he boasted that the collaboration between the private sector and the government, and especially the FBI, had made significant strides in the new technologies, and particularly in artificial intelligence, in which he saw great opportunities but great dangers in what he called the wrong hands. By what he meant by this, the wrong hands, he meant, of course, Russia and China, which he called the bad guys. Apparently it's fine in the hands of the US. Finally, the World Government Summit, which is held in Dubai this month. Klaus Schwab, who is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, which, let me remind you, the World Economic Forum for decades has worked to replace the sovereignty of the nation state and government by democratically elected representatives with the rule of these unelected technocracy in a global political economy which he calls stakeholder capitalism. He declared that those who master the new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution will be, and I quote, the masters of the world. So, my question to you is this. What do you think this new master race, founding another 1,000-year world government, will do with central bank digital currency? Thank you.